My name is Carolyn Murray, and I'm the Vice President of Western Lifeline. And now, without any further ado, let us welcome Mr. Stephen Woodworth.
Blah 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 blah. Blah 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 blah. I'm a bigot. Blah 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 blah. Cure homosexuals. Blah 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 blah. Redefine life. Blah 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 blah. Take away women's rights. Blah blah blah. I'm a lawyer. Blah blah blah. Lawyer. Blah 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 blah. Lawyer. Blah.
Went to the law school here, and we met in law school. As a matter of fact, we were in those days. I don't know if they still do it, but in those days they put our classes together alphabetically. Okay, you know what? As a lawyer, when lawyers do that, as a lawyer, I know that I'm a lawyer. As we used to say in law school, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. I shouldn't want too long, but I have to tell you this story. But I was on the Justice Committee. I was going to try and work in a few more lawyer jokes, but I'm running so late, I'll save them for now. And the third aspect of it, which I think is where we fail most often, I know for many years I did, is in, let me use the word sensitivity. It cannot be understated. I heard of a study which suggested that for some women, the trauma of pregnancy and childbirth is so psychologically debilitating that it is equivalent to the death of their own identity. And of all of those ideals, the most important and precious one that we have is the ideal of free speech. Related to that, the ideal of free assembly. There have been countries and places where free assembly and free speech have not been permitted. And the fact that they're permitted here today is a great blessing. In order to collaborate with someone or some other group, well, you need at least three things. And I contend to you that these three things are built into the DNA of Canadians. And in fact, they make Canada a bright beacon of hope all around the world because of the three principles that were built into our DNA right from the very beginning. The first is that you do have to recognize the equality of every human being. If an Englishman is more equal than a Frenchman, it doesn't work. That may seem like peace because there's no armed conflict, but in reality, it's not peace because it isn't just. And without justice, there can be no peace. So the first principle that Canada was built on is that everybody starts equal. It's in our DNA. The second principle that's necessary in order to make that project work is rule of law. Now, this isn't really as difficult to understand as it might sound. I probably have a knack for making it sound a little too complicated, but the reality is that you cannot have rule of law unless laws are honest. So if I can pass a law that says Englishmen will be considered to be more intelligent than Frenchmen, that's a lie. It's not true. And it isn't really rule of law, it's rule of Woodworth, who wants a leg up over the Frenchman. It just so happens my first Canadian ancestor came over from England and fought in those wars. My wife, by the way, is descended from Castanets, so she had an ancestor on the other side, and I never let her forget that my great-great-great-great-grandfather licked her great-great-great-great-grandfather. But the point is that if you start inventing laws, it's like Humpty Dumpty. If those of you read Lewis Carroll and Through the Looking Glass, one of the lines is that words mean precisely what I want them to mean, nothing more, nothing less. That's not rule of law, that's rule of Humpty Dumpty. Read George Orwell. First of all, Animal Farm. Some animals are more equal than others. George Orwell knew about these problems. Or 1984, the ministry responsible for waging war in 1984, in the novel 1984, was renamed the Ministry of Peace in order to obscure what it was really doing. It was a lie. And you know what the worst of that was? After a while, the word peace became associated with waging war, and there was no longer a word left to describe what peace really is. That's not rule of law. That's rule of tyrants imposing their wishes. So to make it work between two peoples, the French and the English, you had to have rule of law. No one is above the law. No one is more equal than anyone else. It's in the Canadian DNA. The third thing that you needed to make this project of Canada work is the ability to actually have peaceable, respectful dialogue. That is what I do in court, or used to do in court. It's what we try to do in Parliament. But it's essential, because you're going to have different points of view. And short of just saying, I'm sorry, we're going to erase you and your point of view, which again is not peace, not justice, you have to listen and you have to have dialogue. So those three principles are ingrained in the Canadian DNA from the beginning. In my opinion, they are also essential prerequisites of a democracy. You can't have a democracy where some people are more equal than others. You can't have a democracy where there is no dialogue. You know the time when you most need to have dialogue? It's when you disagree most passionately. Ironically, when it's hardest to have dialogue is when you need it most. Those are the ideals which hold us together. If we can't agree on those, if we really have reached the point in Canada where we're willing to accept that some people are more equal than others, if we really have reached that point, if I can't convince you that every human being has worth and dignity, how could I convince anybody of anything about abortion? If I can't convince you that a law that fraudulently decrees that someone isn't a human being is wrong, how could I convince you of anything about abortion? So first things first for people like me is to deal with those fundamental foundational concepts rather than becoming preoccupied with abortion. I'm going to come back to that again in a moment. But it prevents us, by being preoccupied with abortion, it prevents us from tapping into the deep Canadian consensus around those other values that we have to articulate and found. But even more powerful magic is what causes those who disagree with people like me to become so single-mindedly fixated on abortion that they are willing to throw everything else overboard. And so let me just explain to those of you who were shocked by the fact that I believe in magic what I meant by that. People aren't always logical. It took me a long time to figure that out, by the way. I hope some of you are wiser than I am in getting there. We do things because of our feelings. We do things because of our previous experiences, which may or may not relate one-to-one to our present experiences. We do things because of our peer group. We're very tribal. We do things because of trust, or on the opposite side, because of suspicion and mistrust. It's impossible for us to know all the facts about everything. We live our lives on faith. And that's where words can play some magic. Those who wrote or spoke in opposition to Motion 312 seem to think that all they had to do was to shout the word abortion in the crowded theater of Canadian politics and watch the politicians stampeding for the exits, trampling those democratic ideals that I've mentioned to you. Some of you may know of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He wrote a neat little poem almost about what happened in Nazi Germany, and I never get it right, but it's something along the line that, first they came for the communists and I said nothing, then they came for the socialists and I said nothing, and then they came for me and there was no one left to say anything. If we don't start from the proposition that every human being has an equal and inherent worth and dignity, it is a great threat to Canadian democracy. Maybe not today, maybe not 10 years from now, but you know what? That proposal to extend this principle to newborn infants was seriously made. It will be repeated and repeated and repeated until we become desensitized to it. And who will then be next? Will it be people who are in a coma? Will it be people with severe mental disabilities? Who will be next? We have to insist that every human being has an equal and inherent worth and dignity.
Good evening, Mr. Woodworth.
Hi.
My name is Danielle. Firstly, I would just like to say how uncomfortable I am with your rather inaccurate description of the founding of Canada as being based on collaboration and the pursuit of human rights. To mention the mass cultural genocide inflicted on Indigenous communities and peoples across this geographic landscape. That seems rather inaccurate with your emphasis on human rights and dignity for all beings. Secondly, having learned more from your presentation, I think I have the understanding that the motion you made here was not intended to have anything to do with abortion, and rather for the sole purpose of maintaining human rights. That being said, just out of curiosity, I'm wondering what you actually expected to see manifest if the motion was passed beyond just the legal definition of a human being being changed.
Sure. I'd like to respond to both the points you raised, because they're both good ones, and I would never want to claim that we as Canadians have ever entirely lived up to the ideals that we profess. And indeed, it would be correct to say that there were still forgotten persons, even in the outcome of the French-English wars. But saying that doesn't take away from the fact that the French and English did do a great thing in learning to coexist in Canada. And we've built on that. If you were to ask people, at least in the age that I come from, the 60s and 70s and 80s, about the necessity for tolerance, the ability to welcome newcomers, and to accept people for who they are, and to not have a melting pot, but instead to have a mosaic where people can be themselves. That's the kind of tradition that I'm speaking of, and I think that it was planted at the time that the English and French began to try to coexist, and a degree of tolerance was required. As to the effect of the motion, the main objective that I had was to inform people. I really think that this law is a violent, unjust law, which to me is very bad, and I wanted to tell people about it. It's a matter of conscientious objection. If I had been in the American Congress in the 1850s, when the American Supreme Court came up with their version of this law, I would hope I would have put up my hand and said, no, that's wrong. So, at the very least, I wanted to be sure that people would talk about it. And also, I wanted to bring people back to the principles that I've mentioned. You know, I thought it was just providential that Professors Giubilini and Minerva published their paper just a few weeks after I filed my motion, because it really drove home to me how important it is to remind people that this principle, as in subsection 223, has dire implications for way beyond its scope. I don't want to say that thinking about these things might not cause people to change their mind about abortion. Maybe it would. You know, it's relevant information. If someone is able to convince themselves that a child is just a collection of cells or a blob of tissue, they might reach one conclusion, and if they were to understand that a child is actually a human being, they might reach another conclusion. And I never try to say there isn't a relationship, but those issues involve a whole host of other considerations and other circumstances. What I'm pretty sure about is that the concept of abortion, the justification for abortion, really doesn't need to depend on the pretense that another human being is not a human being or has no worth and dignity. That you can acknowledge the worth and dignity of every human being and still find ways to justify abortion. You and I may or may not agree on them, but we could have that discussion. So my hope was just to get this on the table and to speak up for the notion of equality and the intrinsic worth and dignity of every human being, and what happens to it after that is outside the scope of the motion. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for UWestern. I certainly sympathize with where you're coming from. I mean, you know, as you said, we don't glorify war. Same thing with people that are pro-choice like myself. We do not glorify abortion. We simply do what this is saying. Democratic institutions, you know, need to honestly reflect the reality of the situation. So, I mean, honestly, the phrase, the word honestly, that kind of messes with my head because I'm not sure if it means like legitimately or whatever. But in terms of the reality of the situation, if abortion became illegal, I don't think it would, because I don't think that you could find a method to prove what you'd like to prove. You still need to deal with the reality that before babies are actually outside of the mother as prescribed basically by the Constitution, right? That mothers basically have control over the life of their child. And even if you don't provide them with an option to abort the baby, they will seek out other options, such as back alley abortions. So although, and I don't think anyone is pro-abortion, no one likes the idea of abortion, but everyone likes the idea of providing people with a safe choice to do it, instead of risking their health, either the physical health or the mental health, to do it. So in terms of trying to find where life begins, I just think that for me, why I have a hard time understanding where you're coming from is because basically the methodology you would need to use to find where life begins does not exist unless you know otherwise, and ultimately women do have that control over their bodies. Whether you like it or not, that is the reality of the situation, correct?
So let me try to restate two very coherent points that you made. I'm going to do them in reverse order than the way you mentioned them, but the second one you mentioned is that you don't think it's possible for us to demonstrate when life begins. And I'll remind you that that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when does a child become a human being. And that's different than the question of when does life begin. At least scientifically and legally it's different. The answer is that while we may not be able to tell with certainty when a child has all of the attributes, not all of the attributes, poor way to say it, but has the nature of a human being. We may not be able to say with certainty, we may not be able to say in a way that everyone agrees with. We ought to try. We ought to recognize that bad law cannot be sustained and try and make it better. We ought to be able to recognize, as Justice Bertha Wilson did, that our existing law is the wrong point. And whether you may say it's 5 days, 5 weeks, or 5 months, we can look at the evidence and try and make it better. And the fact that we can't do it with certainty isn't the issue. In fact, in our justice system,
What are you talking about? We can't do this.
we
I
have
thought the law did
legal
that.
principles to deal with uncertainty.
Seems to be pretty clear to me.
One of them is, for example, that if someone is accused of an offense, and this was particularly in the old days, capital offenses, dying offenses, they were not found guilty unless that could be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's a question of where does the onus lie? If I think you might possibly be human,
And if I think you're an honest politician,
right? I know that I would want a justice system that would give you the benefit of a reasonable doubt. So there are legal principles that we can use, even if we can't approach perfection. And one last thing I'll say about that question is that actually polls, public opinion polling has been done. And actually, quite startlingly, in 2010, Angus Reid discovered that 79% of Canadians actually think, or at that time thought, that we had a law which limited abortions during the third trimester of a pregnancy. In 2011, just a little more than a year ago, I believe it was Environics did a poll in which they first informed people that in fact there was no such law, and said if there could be a law, what do you think it should be? And the answers were segmented, but cumulatively, somewhere between 60 and 70% of Canadians believe that a child should be protected in the third trimester, just as they think it is, and just really as Justice Wilson was kind of hinting at. So I believe there might be a consensus, but the place to start anyway is to examine the evidence, and the moment you close your mind, you lose. Now, the second part of your question is that the child is in the mother's body and therefore connected to the mother's body, and therefore the mother will always have important interests and claims and control.
well, they do have control.
That's what I just
You
said.
can't ignore that, that's reality.
That's what I just said. The mother will always have important interests and claims and control.
Yes.
And all of that is quite true. However, what is the implication of that? Is the implication then that it doesn't matter whether or not a child is a human being? That's, if I was to try to infer negatively from what you said, that's the way it sounds to me. I don't care whether you're a human being or not, because I have certain control over you, and therefore it doesn't matter whether you're a human being.
It's not that I don't
Yeah.
care.
Well, the mother, I'm
Right,
speaking.
it's just that
Yeah.
mothers, a single mother, 17-year-old girl cannot afford to bring up a
Yeah.
baby. What's she gonna do? I don't
So-
jump on the table?
Let me first of all say that my motion had, of course, nothing to do with those issues, because I recognize how complicated they are, and I didn't intend that we should go past the point of just let's decide, in Canada, do we recognize every human being as human? And then we can, if you want, talk about the implications of that later. I'll give you a thought I had, though.
Right now you can talk about something that doesn't actually really matter because it will improve your re-election chances.
Oh, hardly that.
Why don't you say that actually?
I hope you're right, but I don't think you're right. It matters for the reasons that I've mentioned, that this principle is capable of extension, and that it is dehumanizing to us as a Canadian people. Let me mention something I have yet to research, so I'm getting a hearsay, that Abraham Lincoln said when he introduced the Emancipation Proclamation, or so I'm told. He pointed out that the idea of slavery isn't just bad for the slaves. It's bad for all of us.
They wouldn't have won the war otherwise.
No, it's bad for all, well, if you pardon me, let me finish my thought. The reason that slavery, he said, was bad for all of us is because the notion that people can be treated like chattels, that people can be denied their worth and dignity, that all people are not equal, that some are more equal than others, is corrosive to democracy. And I firmly believe that, and I believe this principle in subsection 223 is also I'll be around for a few minutes afterward and we can
Yeah,
continue
thank you for
privately.
answering my question.
Gentleman after that.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It's been interesting, somewhat internally consistent, but thank you for giving it. My question had to do with your sincerity. I've noticed that despite the fact that your government is taking this position, you've also simultaneously cut research funding for biochemistry and other research projects. So how is it consistent that you can claim interest in this issue while also not funding the research that's required to be informed from the relevant disciplines?
Yeah, well, the question
And
is,
also, what do you plan to do to correct that if in fact you are sincere?
since the Conservative government is cutting back in research in certain areas, and I'm trying to promote scientific examination of subsection 223, I am inconsistent to support the Conservative government. Is that sort of it?
Right, I'm saying that you claim that you need to be informed by the relevant disciplines, but at the same time your government is depriving you of the mechanism to be informed by those said disciplines.
So
I question how committed you are, and if you're
Right.
going to follow that up with trying to get more funding?
So I want to remind you of what I said earlier about private members' business being one of the last remaining tools that a backbencher has to be independent of his or her party or government.
Oh, so he doesn't care about
I wish
science
it
then.
were within my power to dictate priorities to the government. However, the most that I can do on issues of that nature is to make my sentiments known privately to the decision makers, if possible before they make the decisions, and try to influence them in that fashion.
So why haven't we seen you proactively trying to increase funding for these things,
Right.
along with trying to do this, if
Right.
in fact you're consistent?
Often I'm on good terms with some NDP constituents in my riding, and often they're after me to say, well, you know, you really don't agree with the government on this. Why don't you go public and criticize the government about it? And I tell them it would be a little bit like going on television to suggest to my wife that she lose some weight, you know? It's a little destructive of the relationship. Conversations around disagreement between allies and friends, I think you owe them the benefit of having those conversations in private. If I thought that there was,
private,
for example,
right. Let's
a way
not talk about
that
it.
by introducing a motion in Parliament to increase funding for youth criminal justice initiatives, that I could actually make a difference, I would consider it.
Why else did you get into politics other than make a difference, and now you're saying you can't? That seems rather
I said by introducing a motion publicly on that. But the difference that I can make is in the private discussions that I have with my caucus colleagues on issues of that nature of government policy. I can also make a difference through the private members' business that I submit. And I hope it's clear to people that there's at least one member of Parliament who does believe that we should inform ourselves from the relevant disciplines. Whether or not I can convince the government of that through my private members' bill, probably not. Whether I can convince the government of that through my private discussions with ministers and colleagues, likely not either, but I can try. It's just a question of using the means that one has available. Yes, sir.
Just a really quick question here. You say that every human being has equal rights. Did you vote against the immigration bill? Pardon me? Did you vote against the immigration bill?
Which immigration bill are you referring to?
Maybe the bunch of them that have gone through, especially the one that puts.
I am not aware. I see where you're going, so let me try and restate that. The gentleman thinks that some of the government's legislation on immigration denies the dignity and worth of some immigrants. Is that a fair statement of what you said? So to be consistent, once again, I have to vote against the government publicly to be consistent. Well, first of all, I do want to go back to a point I made earlier, that no one's rights are unlimited. And as I said in relation to the question of abortion, just because a child is a human being doesn't mean the child's rights always have to predominate over the mother's rights. Just because a child is a human being doesn't mean we couldn't decide that the mother's rights should always overcome the child's rights. One thing we never do in a civilized country or a democracy is that when rights come into conflict, we never say, all right, person A is a human being and person B is not, therefore we can just forget about it. Now, if there was a law passed that said that an immigrant is not a human being, you can darn well bet I'd vote against that. If there's a law passed that says that we can only accept 246,000 immigrants a year into Canada, and anybody who comes illegally has to be returned to their country, that's a different issue. Shall we give him a follow-up? Did you have a follow-up, a second letter?
Bring up the heart attacks.
Okay.
Bring up the heart attacks.
Closer to the front here.
Thank you very much for your talk.
You're welcome.
Last week, Professor Michael Ignatieff was speaking in this building, and he raised the issue that often in politics we wind up with a politics of enemies rather than a politics of adversaries or opponents. And I think that sort of reality really comes to the fore when we try to discuss the issue of abortion. Can you talk about ways in which we can work to cultivate a politics of opponents on issues of extreme contention like this?
Good, very good question, and it reminds me of a comment that our first questioner mentioned when she started out by saying, I'm not very comfortable with it. And I want you to know I'm not really very comfortable either, you know. And so that's actually a good starting point to recognize the fact
Yep, thumbs up. Thumbs up on that.
We have differing points of view that we make each other uncomfortable. You can't run from it, though. And the reality is that if you have confidence in yourself and you know what your point of view is, you shouldn't feel threatened. I do, by the way. I started out wrongly by picking on anybody. I didn't mean to. But I feel threatened sometimes when people disagree with me, but really I shouldn't. And as a human being with a brain, I try to get control of my background and sit back and say, look, you know, I may want to run or I may want to fight, but really I shouldn't, because I have confidence in what I'm saying, and I want the chance to talk to people about it, and I don't mind listening to other people, and providing they treat me with respect, I get to know them and hear what they have to say, and at the end of the day, if we don't agree, at least we can all come away and say, look, at least I sort of have at least a bit of understanding about where the other person is coming from, what's important to them, what they rank in priority, and they know what I rank in priority, and maybe somewhere we can, at some future date, match them up. In Parliament, actually, we have rules, you know, about things like that to help. You're not permitted to call anyone a liar in Parliament. Now, of course, people being people, there's lots of imaginative ways found to call people liars without actually saying so. But the reason we do that... Oh, I didn't mean to start. Just generally, that if you start out with both guns blazing, you won't get anywhere. What are you trying to do when you have a conversation with anybody? You're not, I mean, well, unfortunately, a lot of people are just trying to vent, you know. And venting, I guess, has its place, but it doesn't really make the world a better place. What we're trying to do when we have a conversation like this is to come to an understanding, to be able to reach into each other and see what's important to one another, and I believe ultimately we all start from the same base. It's where I'm starting. I doubt there's anyone in this room that disagrees with those principles. Try and find the commonalities and see where they lead you. So I'll go back to truthfulness, fairness, and sensitivity. In the back row there.
Do you have an opinion on how subsection 223 should read?
Well, you know, I very carefully
when he starts talking about abortion.
withheld my opinion. Not because I don't have one, but actually this is actually a great segue. The question is, do I have an opinion about how subsection 223 should read? And actually, this is a great segue from the last question. Because actually, I really believe that if I want to sit down and have a conversation with you about something, I shouldn't start by saying, look, this is what I believe and this is how it's going to be. I really should try intellectually to keep an open mind. As much as I got my own opinions, I should at least try and listen, and I should try and respect others and examine the facts together. I have my own ideas about the science, but I'm not a scientist, and it wouldn't hurt me to hear it from scientists. So it was contrary to what I was attempting to accomplish in promoting an open-minded discussion for me to go in and say, look, this is where I'd like you to end up. I don't even want the committee to express such an opinion. I deliberately instructed the committee not to express its opinion about where it thinks the law should be, but instead to put all the options on the table.
Well, we're all friends here. Do you have an opinion?
Oh, I have an opinion, but that's not what I'm here to do. I'm here to find out what your opinion is. I'm here to find out what the science has to say. I'm trying to get people to talk in an open-minded way. If you set up an opinion, when I was on the school board for a while, it used to drive me nuts that we would assign some investigation to committee, and the committee would come back with a recommendation, a single recommendation. You know what would happen the very first thing when you put a single recommendation on the table? People talk about that recommendation. All the other options drop off. People become polarized over a single recommendation. I don't want that. Yes, sir.
We're entangled right now. The war in Afghanistan is downturning. There's going to be a huge trade deal with China that's going to go through next month. The last quarter, the Canadian economy shrunk. And I'm curious as to whose good this is to go in and make an attempt to change the charter as to what a Canadian, as to what a human being is defined as. Whose interest is this in? Because we both know that that's going to take a very, very long time.
Yeah. The question is, why bother, I guess? Because there's other more important issues, right? Is that the question?
Yeah, I guess you can sum it down.
Okay. It's true, there are certainly a lot of other important issues. The question is there any other issue that is more important than a law which fraudulently declares that someone isn't a human being?
But this was decided on in the 80s, and the majority of Canadians, the majority of Canadians polled are in favor of abortion.
Well, I'm sorry, it's not about abortion, and it wasn't decided upon in the 80s. This is what was decided in the 80s. Justice Wilson wrote the decision that did away with our last abortion law. She most specifically did not decide this point. She referred it to Ottawa, and Ottawa has dropped the ball. Ottawa hasn't decided this point. Now let me finish answering your question about the issue of the importance of other issues. It's hard for me because I'm a lawyer, and I was steeped from an early age in my education in concepts of justice. And to be honest with you, I know there are people out there who aren't lawyers, and they may not feel the same way that I do about justice. For me, a just legal system is what binds everything else together. To paraphrase probably Martin Luther King Jr., an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I was actually floored the first time a reporter asked me that question. Why are you doing this? I said, look, doesn't justice matter? Well, it matters to me, and this is the most unjust law we have in Canada, and there's no excuse for it, and it's like having a 400-year-old piece of straw furniture sitting in your living room, stinking up the whole house of your justice system. The implications of allowing the government to pick and choose who to value and who not to value, to me, are highly important. But I recognize they may not be as important to others.
See how he's plugging his nose?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Woodworth, for your
You're welcome.
report. Very interesting. My name is Alicia Gabriel, and I'm a physician. I'm specializing in pediatrics. So I thought it would be interesting maybe to get your standpoint on this law from a medical perspective. And you mentioned earlier in your talk about the dissertation rule about doing surgery on the child with the mother. So in my view, this law is actually highly inaccurate in a medical sense, because if the child isn't a human being until they're completely preceded from their mother, then why are we doing fetal surgery when the child is not a human being? So from a medical standpoint, it's archaic, and I kind of want to hear your perspective on that.
Well, but the thing is, your perspective is worth more than mine, because I'm not a doctor, I'm a lawyer. And so my motion, again, this is why, to the gentleman at the back, my opinion about this isn't so important. The motion and what I'm proposing is simply that we hear from people who have the expertise, just as Justice Wilson suggested, and then everyone can reach a more informed conclusion. So I could venture any kind of opinion, but it wouldn't be medically sound. What it really comes down to is there's two ways you can look at this. You can say, well, a child is not a human being before birth, in which case section 223 is just fine. That is, there's two ways that people who oppose motion 312 can look at it. They can say a child is not a human being before birth, and that's what I believe, and I don't need to hear evidence about it. Or they can say a child is a human being before birth, but I still want to declare that human being to be not human and let it go to dignity. And I don't accept either of those options.
You should go to jail for that. Yeah. So if you have a tested baby.
So I want to just close by saying thank you very much. And if the hall is open long enough, I will remain afterward and welcome individual conversations. But thank you very much for your patience, and I hope I didn't.
We don't know how to have a baby the normal way. If we go and get our stuff mixed up in a petri dish and have that baby implanted somewhere, and then there's extra ones left over, and we dispose of them,
we're murderers.
Then
murderers. Murderers. Can I have my 2 hours back now? It's like, fuck. Yeah, for some reason people are clapping this guy, and I really don't understand why. Yeah, it's only the 3-year-olds in the front that agree with him. Yeah. So. Anyway, they arrested Mike, so we'll have an interesting time getting out of here.